this conference throughout the semester. So it's a particular treat for my students to hear from so many of you. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce the panelists for this session, and then I'll tell you a bit about what we have planned. So first, Ulrich Baer is a university professor of comparative literature, German and English at NYU, and the author of What Snowflakes Get Right: Free Speech, Truth, and Equality on Campus. He is also the host of the podcast Think About It, which contains dozens of in-depth interviews with scholars around this complex issue. We also have Keith Whittington, and he is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University and the chair of the newly formed Academic Freedom Alliance. Keith is the author of Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. I highly recommend work by both of these prominent scholars on this topic, and I know that we are in for an excellent discussion. So our plan is for Ulrich and Keith to each take a few minutes to summarize the heart of their argument about free speech on campus, and then we will launch into a conversation initially between the two of them, eventually broadening out to the other folks who are participating here, who we see on the screen, and then of course the audience. So be thinking about good questions that you have. Now, I want to let you know that I'm expecting that this will be not so much a debate between antagonists, but much more like a conversation between colleagues. And I think in this session, actually, we will see a model of the type of thoughtful, deep, productive engagement that we can have across difference. So I'm really looking forward to this. Now, the framing for the session is complete, and so I will turn it over to Uli to start us into the heart of the matter.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you, Arthur and Justin, for inviting me to this conference. So I've learned an enormous amount in the last 2 days already, and I really appreciate being part of this. I also want to say thank you to Professor Whittington to get us into this conversation, and congratulations on being named to the study of the Supreme Court by President Biden. So I'm fully aware that every second I take out of your day now really takes it away from something quite vital to our republic. So as people probably found out in the last 2 days, Professor Whittington is going to study the parameters of the Supreme Court. And I'm interested in this question in general of what are the parameters and what kind of debate and questions can we afford to have on parameters of how we structure life in the university and in society, and what questions are perhaps off limits because they actually go to the heart and ultimately undermine such parameters. And I will say a few words where I come from in my work, because I think it'll allow us to perhaps see why my perspective as a scholar in the humanities and a scholar of literature and photography informs my thinking of free speech in the university and how it does so. And we are hoping for a dialogue between not just two people, but also perhaps with the caveat that I can't speak for my entire field, I'll try to capture a bit of what the humanities angle on this is. So my concern with free speech is really motivated by my interest in voices, readers, listeners, and speakers, and the rich variety of what John Stuart Mill called famously experiments in living. My motivation stems from a deep commitment to the university to offer amazing, startling, and also unsettling opportunities to discover new voices and ideas, and also discover which parts of our cherished and sometimes settled and ingrained beliefs may be open and necessary to change. The university for me is a place of teaching and learning, but also transformation. As a scholar of the humanities, I'm deeply engaged in studying and discovering understudied voices, and in elucidating how literature and the arts in general, perhaps, allow us to make sense of the world, and how literature can challenge prevailing definitions of our shared reality. And I'll say something about this in particular, how literature does it in a different way from other fields or human endeavors. I'm interested in literature conveys something different from the sociological, psychological, or historical truth that we can glean from other disciplines and other sets of data. I'm also interested in literature as something a little bit different from what has been voiced in this conference before, as a kind of aesthetic education that teaches us how to be moral beings. I have my doubts that actually novels can teach us to be good people, but I'm interested in literature for another reason, that literature reminds us that there's not just a truth out there, which can be historically verified, but there's authenticity in the telling. And that is what I want to put a little bit of emphasis on. The words I'm going to use is the authenticity in the telling, which links to my interest in experience. And I'll say something about that, and then I would love to ask Keith a little bit about that, the definition or understanding of experience. So my interest in free speech is less with people yelling in the theater, which we all know happens on campuses, but really with voices that contribute something new and challenge or improve existing paradigms. And what is linked to this experience of really discovering new voices in the university is the capacity to listen. I think free speech without the capacity to listen in the university is a rather anemic concept, if not a totally pointless one. If we just have free speech, it's one-sided, someone standing up there on a platform. I think listening is something that is vitally important for the function of speech in the university. And literature is a way of teaching us to listen to someone we're unfamiliar with and to ways of presenting a truth in ways we're not accustomed to. So my concern with the richness of human experience is not only found in the field of literary studies or photography studies where I teach, and I teach across the university. It has informed and shaped, and I think improved many different disciplines over the last 50 years or so. And I'll summarize here, it's shorthand of course, but for example, the entire field of historiography has reckoned and tried to understand how human experience registers when that experience was not publicly available in the archives. So to make a very simple point, Joan Scott, historians like Joan Scott, Saul Friedlander, they've said, how does experience register if there's no archival record of it? Because, for instance, people were not allowed to be educated, had no access to publications, were deprived of writing. As Professor Kennedy pointed out on Thursday, there's a book, Self-Taught, about African Americans who had to find the means of public expression on their own and outside of dominant ways of doing it. So I'm interested in free speech, especially in literary works, by people who were never granted the benefit of recognition by the state or by society, by the courts or by Congress, and in many cases even deprived of the status of citizens or of subjects or full human beings. But all of those people spoke. And I'm interested in this dimension of speech as much in the legally sanctioned First Amendment protected, you have the right to speak, and all these other voices and people who have spoken in America for quite a long time. And I've devoted quite a lot of time of my research to actually get those stories into a conversation. My point is not to replace a canon and to swap out Walt Whitman for John Rollins Ridge, who is a different poet writing at the same time, but to say this adds something to our understanding, how we even define speech, to look at speech that doesn't register in the ways that we are accustomed to, that doesn't show up in the archive in a way as printed material, for example. So in the humanities, the perspective is essentially that pluralism and multiplicity is the premise of our field. It is not an aim we have to achieve more plurality or multiplicity. This is where we start out of. I'm going to use a bit of shorthand here, but for humanities scholars, maintaining the status quo is not the point. It is actually although preserving the tradition is an important part of our work. I've edited a lot of volumes of classical writers. There's a part of maintaining that. But the status quo is the assumption that the parameters by which we assess our object of study will change. I'll give you the three definitions of how literary works are usually kind of categorized for inclusion. And I'd like you to think about this categorization as how we think of free speech as an analogous. So in literature, we think of artistic originality, cognitive originality, and verbal splendor. That a work is beautiful, a poem says something different, it's new, original, that matters. But those parameters are constantly being interrogated. They're never static, that we say, we know what verbal splendor, we know what cognitive originality is. And why I use this analogy of how literature keeps on redefining its object of study, I'm hoping this could lead to a conversation of what if we actually thought about the parameters around this word free speech, the way we think about the canon, that it could shift and we could have different new understandings. And I'll say two more things, what I mean by what could be done. And the spirit of my remarks and the spirit of my work is really that I'm deeply committed to the university as a place of enormous opportunity. I think the university can, in some instances, be an engine of social progress. And I don't mean progressive in a kind of political sort of sense on one side. It could be an engine of social progress. And I'm really interested in Professor Whittington here because it is related to how cultural assumptions, our norms and mores shift, and how the legal world responds to that, and it's either behind or ahead of them. Literature works in a different place, art works in a different place. It doesn't correspond to Supreme Court decisions. People did not wait, to make that point again, until some First Amendment lawyers came along and defended them. They did not wait for the ACLU to give them the right to publish a poem. So what I mean is that the university has this opportunity actually to rethink some of the assumptions we have made. And the assumptions we have made, which have been, and Professor Whittington lays this out in his book, Speak Freely, that free speech, the way it has been defined as the status quo, has been beneficial to the greatest amount of people. And I would take issue with that. And I would think, what if we actually think of the status quo, of the current understanding, cultural as much as legal, of free speech as not having granted the most amount of people to actually speak and participate. That the gatekeeping function in the status quo and the reversion to a kind of normalcy is not, if we all just agreed free speech is so important, the world would be good. This is where a humanities scholar comes in. I would say, good for whom? Who pays the price of this goodness? So if we revert to a sort of understanding of the status quo and implement that, who benefits? Who loses out? And then the other thing, I'll end on this here, that I'm for humanities scholars, sometimes we sort of look with a little bit of envy at the field of legal studies, a little bit of envy and a little bit of also kind of perplexity, because it seems sometimes like a zero-sum game. There's free speech, that's an absolute value. There's equality, there's another value. You have to find one and just settle for one or the other. And in my book, I really try to put into play a conversation between competing principles, as much legal as normative, in the university. Legal meaning that free speech, when it's a public university, and with the caveat that the First Amendment is not the best guide for university life, probably, but that nonetheless, let's all assume the First Amendment is a really good guide for free etc. We know this. So students come to the university today and say, we're guaranteed free speech according to First Amendment doctrine, etc., and norms. And we're also guaranteed equality. And I use the word equality very carefully here, and I would be interested in Professor Whittington, because I think the word equality matters since it is anchored in the law. And I'm not using social justice, diversity, or terms like that, which are not anchored in the law, but equality is. And I asked this question of Professor Kennedy on Thursday. So when our students come in and say, hey, I'm registered in this university here, and I'm promised equality of opportunity and access to all facilities and treatment, and you're inviting speaker after speaker who says, people like me should not be allowed in certain classrooms or shouldn't be allowed in this campus or don't have a right to be here, doesn't this conflict with what you're doing as a university? This came up in the previous discussion, what Amna said about student life orientation, how students are told that the university has a set of values, a set of norms and behaviors. And then they're told, oh, by the way, free speech overrides that. In my book, I try to put this tension into a kind of productive conversation rather than say, I'm going to settle in favor of one over the other and say equality, not diversity, inclusion, equity, but equality must trump freedom of speech. And as you know, and as the legal scholars in this room know, I'm not novel to this argument. You know, Professor Kennedy referred to some of the thinkers, Richard Delgado, Mary Matsuda, different people, Catherine McKinnon, who have advanced that equality is in tension with absolute freedom of speech or current freedom of speech jurisprudence. But there may be a moment here to rethink something. So I'll stop right here, and I'll be happy to go into sort of my other motivations for doing this. And I really look forward to it. And as Christine said, thank you so much. And Arthur, we wanted this to be a conversation, and we hope people will jump in and engage with us. Thank you.
So thanks so much for that. That was a terrific start. I think it will be a very productive conversation, which we'll find that there's a lot of agreements as well as some points of disagreement. I hope we get all that on the table. I also want to take a moment just to thank the organizers of this conference for their persistence in trying to carry it forward. We were originally supposed to be meeting just after the pandemic first hit, and we've been trying to reschedule ever since. And I'm glad that we're finally able to get together even in this format to talk about these important issues. And it's been a terrific and enlightening conference. So hopefully I won't bring that down too much in my own remarks. I wanted to start with the question that's asked in the title of the panel itself, which is free speech as traditionally interpreted even the right ideal for universities? And I think in an important sense, it's not. That's not necessarily what it is we're trying to aim at and aim for in a university context, but I think there are important lessons to be learned from our free speech experience that's helpful in thinking about the specific context of universities and how they operate. And then there are components of free speech I think are directly relevant and are much closer to the ideal of what it is we're trying to accomplish, at least in part, on university campuses. So when I think about what universities are trying to do at heart, I think at the very center of what it is we're trying to accomplish is to truthfully convey to students and to the outside world and to our colleagues our best understanding of how the world operates, our best understanding of the subject matters that we are trying to explore, while simultaneously trying to constantly expand and push on the frontiers of that understanding to reassess what it is we think we know and to gain new knowledge, or at least try to gain new knowledge through our research and sometimes through teaching and through the other activities that we're engaged in on college campuses. In order to be able to serve that function effectively, we need an extraordinary scope for an ability to explore ideas. We need to be able to ask difficult questions. We need to be able to explore controversial subjects. We need to have freedom to follow evidence and arguments wherever they might lead us, even if they lead us to conclusions that are quite unpopular, whether they're unpopular with our colleagues, they're unpopular with our students, or unpopular with the broader community. In that sense, at the very heart of what universities do is a kind of intellectual enterprise. And that intellectual enterprise is quite similar to what free speech concerns are concerned with protecting in general. How do you provide people with the kind of freedom to explore ideas, to articulate their own understandings, to listen to others who have different understandings, work through those kinds of arguments and concerns, and potentially reach new conclusions on the other end of that. At the same time, of course, the way universities operate, we make all kinds of departures from what we might think of from a constitutional perspective or legal perspective is critical to a free speech environment as we understand it in other kinds of contexts. We don't expect students to have the same rights of free speech as faculty in a classroom, for example. We expect the students to be constrained in what it is they do. We expect faculty to exercise some degree of authority within the classroom in order to make those productive learning environments, in order to keep on task, in order to successfully convey the information that we're trying to convey and to maximize the learning environment that's going to occur in those classrooms. We expect, likewise, faculty not to exercise free speech, strictly understood, within a classroom context. We put faculty in front of a class in order to teach a particular subject. They have a captive audience of students to try to gain information from that faculty member in that context. We provide that faculty member a great deal of freedom in how they explore that subject, how they try to convey that information. But on the other hand, we expect a faculty member in a classroom to stick to the actual subject of the class and not to be introducing controversial matters that are not relevant to the subject. We don't expect a faculty member to be conveying professionally incompetent information to the students. We expect the faculty member to be conveying what it is that their discipline understands to be correct about the subject in which they're teaching. Those are limitations on a free speech environment. They're limitations we wouldn't tolerate in other kinds of contexts, but they're part and parcel of what we expect happens in a classroom context. There's all kinds of aspects of university life, especially university life most closely associated with scholarly aspects of university life, they're designed to restrict speech in various ways, designed to channel speech in various ways. But at the same time, even in those contexts, I think we learn important lessons from the larger free speech tradition and its set of concerns. We ought to have learned from that history healthy skepticism of those who might claim the authority to be able to suppress ideas and suppress speech in general. So part of, I think, of what we have learned from the history of free speech debates, and very much has relevance for thinking about restrictions on speech and thought and debate in a university context, is the difficulty of empowering any particular censor with the authority to make decisions about which kinds of ideas can be expressed on a college campus and which ones cannot. We've learned in general, in all kinds of contexts, that empowering people to make those decisions also leads to very bad results. And as a consequence, academia has tried to decentralize as much as possible the kinds of choices that get made about what kinds of authority can be exercised to limit and contain speech. So even taking the context I noted a while ago, where we expect a faculty member to engage in professionally competent speech when they're in front of students in a classroom, we expect a faculty member to stick to their subject matter when they're speaking to a classroom of students. On the other hand, I think we ought to be fairly nervous to unilaterally empower a university president, for example, to make decisions as to whether or not an individual faculty member in an individual classroom actually stuck to their subject well enough, or actually conveyed information that we thought was sufficiently professionally competent. Part of what we expect is that the faculty are judged by their peers in making those kind of determinations, others with disciplinary knowledge, others with experience in the classroom who can make assessments about whether the particular speech in question falls within the broad boundaries of academic freedom, as understood to be professionally competent speech is appropriate for somebody to do in that context. That still requires judgment. There are contexts in which that will sometimes require sanctioning people for the speech that they engage in. But we try to decentralize that as much as possible so as to not empower people to exercise that censorial role, and especially not to exercise it in a context in which it might reduce the overall amount of speech and reduce the amount of critical inquiry that occurs in the classroom on the whole. So every time when we're thinking about ways in which we might be suppressing speech or restricting speech, I think it's critically important to be thinking about who we're going to empower to do that, under what circumstances and what kinds of limits. And we ought to be very skeptical of proposals to do it. I should also just note very briefly before concluding, which is that there are aspects of campus that we've increasingly recognized as looking much more like a free-form free speech environment, which is to say much of what students do, and indeed what faculty sometimes engage in as well, on the university campus outside the scholarly arena, increasingly does look like a public park. They are places in which we can have conversations about matters of general public concern, and we have that quite freely. As we would as citizens of a democracy more generally. So the universities over the course of the 20th century increasingly recognized they need to make space available on their campuses for students to engage in those kinds of robust debates about political concerns, for example, the students themselves cared about. The students should have the freedom to invite certain speakers to come to campus precisely to engage in those kinds of debates in ways that students find interesting, not ways that their faculty necessarily approve of, neither the student speakers nor the outside speakers the students might want to hear from, or necessarily people that faculty would endorse as having good ideas or good views, or that meet some kind of faculty standard as to what kinds of ideas ought to be expressed on campus. They aren't necessarily the ideas we would expect to see expressed in the context of a classroom, for example, or in the context of scholarly research and publications. But they are ideas that we do expect to be expressed in the public sphere. And universities are important contributors to that larger public sphere in which people talk about and engage with ideas more generally. And in that context in particular, we want to be extremely skeptical of efforts to shut down speech, restrict speech, and limit it. One thing Professor Baer mentioned is who pays the cost when we have free speech. And the answer often is that those with power pay the cost when we have free speech. And it's precisely those with power who want and have the capacity to prevent and suppress and exclude those who would want to challenge them. It's precisely because we want to keep our intellectual environment open to challenges the status quo, challenges to existing power structures, challenges to existing authority, that we don't want to give those with authority the ability to suppress those ideas and restrict those kinds of expressions of speech. And college campuses ought to be a model for that, a model for places in which we teach people to engage seriously with hard ideas take seriously their opponents, think through those arguments, come to real conclusions about what they think about those ideas. And we would lose something very important if instead we tried to suppress those ideas so that we didn't have to engage in those hard debates.
All right, an excellent start to our conversation. So we'll certainly have time to get into areas and explore areas where you disagree and are thinking of different approaches to this. But before we go down that path, I actually would be really curious to hear your thoughts on where you do agree, where you have consensus. So who would like to start for that?
I'm kind of dying to have Randy say something, but Christine, I'll just say, I think Keith and I are both committed to the university as a place that actually does something a little bit better than society, that actually advances knowledge in a certain way. I think we disagree in a certain way that, I think Keith, if I can phrase it, it's maybe a useful way to do it, maybe I'm getting you wrong, to say people should be given the least amount of power to restrict speech. The flip side is, I think people always have power to regulate speech in the university, and some people will have that power. It's the idea that administrators won't, or faculty or deans or presidents won't have that power. They do. Secondly, my other concern is that the university speaks constantly through actions and through words. And even if a lucky president can opt out this weekend and not issue a statement, they're still speaking by not making a statement. Students are totally attuned to that. Not making a statement is speaking. So I would be curious where Keith thinks where this power argument is, because as we've also seen, I'll give you two counterexamples, that ethnic studies, Black studies, feminist studies, gender studies were largely driven from student movements in California in the 60s, et cetera, at different schools. Even student government was driven by that. So that gave deans and administrators an enormous amount of power to enable some kind of speech. Why would that not be a problem? Because administrators do design programs and set up whole curricula, et cetera. So the question of power is probably where Keith is probably much more worried about giving some people power. I'm thinking people already have that power. So how do we find a mechanism to make it work for the great amount of people? But I'd love to hear what Professor Kennedy has to say as well. So just Keith, maybe just you can find that place where we disagree, and then we can get some questions.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, where exactly the disagreements are. I think there's actually a fair amount of agreement. I think some of the disagreements are in the details of how to think about some specific circumstances in which we think speech ought to be restricted. I do like this idea that was just put on the table, thinking about how do you expand and further empower people on campus to engage in more speech and a wider array of speech-like activities. And some of that does come through creating new kinds of disciplines on campuses and new departments and other activities. In general, I'm a little skeptical about empowering deans to do that specifically. I prefer these be much more faculty-driven decisions. But I know that's a kind of nostalgia for a time in which there are fewer deans and more faculty on college campuses, and that we're further away from that world. But I do, in general, worry quite a bit about sort of the kind of power that we've given to campus administrators, both to suppress speech, but also to engage in new openings for speech-like activities on campuses. And some of what was suggested earlier about first-year orientation, for example, is reflective of that, in which we've handed off a very important aspect of how we introduce students to university life and what it is universities are for, mostly to a set of campus administrators who have their own agenda, their own concerns that they want to express to students through those vehicles, and often I think lead students in a fairly different direction than the faculty would prefer about how to introduce students to what it is that we're trying to do on a college campus moving forward. And I think it is a kind of example of why we should be a little nervous about handing off too much power and authority to campus administrators, even for opening up new avenues for speech, let alone for trying to close off avenues for speech.
Thank you. Actually, so let's go to our panelists, our larger panelists. Randy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you both for wonderful talks. I have a comment and a question. The comment goes to Uli and equality. And you 2 days ago, you put that question to me, and I want to come back with a response and get your reaction to it. So if a student says, I've come to this campus and I was promised that I would, be an equal member of this campus. And now you have people who are questioning, whether I should be here. And therefore I feel like I'm being put down. My response to that person, I think, would be, listen, you're not being put down. The university is treating you like it treats everyone else as part of a community of thinkers. And if, we expect you, just like we expect everyone else, to learn and to interact. And if somebody is challenging you radically, indeed challenging whether you should be here, we expect you to listen and to figure and to think hard. And if you disagree with that person, to disagree and express why you disagree to the community. That's you're in no different position than, let's imagine that an atheist comes and says that people who are religious are, may be nice, but they're deluded. And then the religious person comes and says, how can you have this outspoken, how can you have this Christopher Hitchens-like character come and insult me? And what? You're not going to have the outspoken atheist. You're not going to allow that person to say what that person thinks, even though the religious person might think and might reasonably think that they have been insulted. It doesn't seem to me that the feeling of insult, is the institution putting somebody down. So, but I'd like to get your reaction to that. As for Keith, my question for Keith would be actually a question that Professor Tetlock put on the floor yesterday, the question of boundaries. So Keith, if a person who said that they are a National Socialist, they are a Nazi, they really, they may be very learned, but they are a learned Nazi. Would it be wrong if that person was seeking membership in the scholarly community of, I don't know, you name your university, I don't care what, name whatever, public, private, would it be bad, in your view, for a member of the faculty to say, nope, can't, whether this person is in English, whether this person is in chemistry, whether this person is political science, if this person is a believer in National Socialism, no, I am not going to vote for this person to be part of the scholarly community. Is that stance wrong? Those are my two responses. But again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Randy. So on the equality issue, so I would say if a student comes to me and says, which happens, a student comes and says, I'm not being treated equitably here. And then they would say, I'm offended, my feelings, etc. That's why I wrote my book and said, offended feelings, I'm listening and I'm sorry, we can't do much about them. But then I would say, the university has already been speaking to you for quite a long time and has assured you of other commitments and values and norms. So when you're coming in and saying, I'm not being treated equally, they're not making it up and saying, I have this weird sensibility and I'm so sensitive. I'm saying, wait. From the beginning, you have told me that I should not be treated in a certain way and I should not be talked about in certain ways. So what Amna talked about earlier, student orientation, etc. There's a set of values and norms which are not legal necessarily, but they're in play. So I think the university cannot then say, well, that's on you, go in there into that lecture hall and defend your own selfhood, which I did in my book, I draw that line at that place, but we can talk about that. I say defending your own selfhood is not conducive to a learning environment. When you put a student on the spot and say, please explain whether you should be in this classroom or whether you're even fully human, it's a settled debate. We don't have those debates. But let me just go to the equality part. So I would say to the student, I'm listening to you. So first of all, in a university, I would say, what do you think we should do to the student? And I would not, and I wrote my book because I felt the answer cannot be, hey, First Amendment, here it is, you are wrong. To even feel this. You said something really important. You said, if they're reasonably thinking this, then as a university, you should say, okay, what do we do with this now? And my whole impetus was that I actually, to be frank, when I wrote this, the original op-ed and then this book, I was a little bit disconcerted that I felt a lot of my colleagues had this kind of disdain for the student complaints and said they should get over it, they should put up with it. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but I'm saying the student has a right to say, are you doing enough to actually allow me to stand up in this lecture hall of 1,200 people and stand up and say, I actually am the person you're targeting here. All eyes on me right now. And I actually think what you're saying is so detrimental to my participation in this community that I don't think this jives with the values of the university. I think the university cannot leave somebody alone at that moment and pretend, oh, at that moment, suddenly free speech is the absolute rule. And we have nothing to do with this. You fight it out with the speaker on the stage, which is, first of all, not the format that usually happens. And then power is a really important thing here. So when you're asking this of a student, I don't think you can say, Randy, then everybody is treated the same here because power is part of a hierarchical institution. So in some ways, you go up against famous lecturer X or firebrand Z or something like that, and you put yourself out there in front of 1,200 people who are there for the entertainment value, and you're going to defend your right to belong to the community. That, I think, is a pretty heavy burden to place on students. So I thought, how does the university actually responsibly act right now? And here we get kind of into the details that Keith wanted to talk about. What do you do then? First of all, counter-programming is vital, and counter-programming that is academic in nature. With all due respect to student life, it is not the moment just to do sort of support and diversity training and wellness. This is actually to say, how do you get the tools that Professor Kennedy can teach? And I teach your take on affirmative action to my students all the time. I say, strategically, affirmative action is about justice, not diversity. Diversity is not going to fly, not going to work. My students are totally attentive to that. They're like, oh, wow, now we have a conceptual tool to articulate our grievance that can be heard by the other side. So that's what I'm interested in, that students can then say, here's a venue in which you can be heard, rather than, and I don't put the blame on students, rather than not being heard because you're not articulate enough, your offended feelings, so I'm saying they're 19 years old. I don't expect them to have the conceptual vocabularies and our experience. And it's not a matter of strength and weakness, but of positioning. So you see what I'm saying? I'm saying this is the moment to unpack this and not to sort of jump on them and say, well, too bad about this equality promise, but free speech trumps that right here.
I don't think we're in disagreement, though. I mean, because I don't hear you saying to the student, you've complained to me, and therefore, we're not going to allow so-and-so to be on campus. We're not going to allow so-and-so to say such and such. What I hear you saying is, I'm listening to you. I understand your, how you want to be. And we're an educational institution, by the way. I want you to read this, and this. So when so-and-so comes, you can stand up in front of 2,000 people and say what you want to say. And not only that, not only do I want you to read such and such, but maybe I want to moot this. Maybe I want to be that person with whom you want to argue. Maybe we want to actually put this into, let's switch roles. Let's you be that person, and let me be you. And then after 20 minutes, let's switch roles so that you become very fluent in this, so that this is not such a traumatic thing, such that you are actually very familiar with the arguments, and you're okay with the arguments, and you're not scared, and you're not gonna, just sort of dissolve in a puddle of tears.
Well,
it seems to me that you and me are
yeah, 2 points, Randy. I think you teach in a law school. I would be so reluctant to say, oh, we can switch positions for 20 minutes and I'm going to enact this other role. I would say I'm just not going to say to a student who comes and says, this situation is for me like this because of who I am. And I'm going to say, oh, let me just assume I'm you. I don't know. I actually don't know what it feels to be you in this moment. But I want to say something else here. So quite famously, Toni Morrison at some point said quite famously, racism is just a way to distract us from doing our work. What if the student says, yeah, thanks, Professor Kennedy, great. Now I'm going to have to learn how to deal with such an idiot who is this firebrand who's been sponsored by some organization and gets paid tens of thousands of dollars to come to my campus. This is a waste of my time. I'm not here to defend that I'm human or not. I'm not here to defend whether I belong in a STEM field because I'm a woman. That is just not what I'm supposed to be doing. So if the student says, you know, Professor Baer, I don't want to learn all this. I deal with it all the time. Thank you so much. But I'm not here to even study such things. I actually just want to get ahead with my program. And this guy comes in and I walk out of the room and people sort of look at me and say like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have students like this. So in some ways, you mean, you know what I'm saying, that the discussion around equality can also become a distraction to education.
No, on that, I disagree totally.
Okay.
On that, I'm very impatient because at that point, so the student complains, the teacher is responding, and then the student says, oh, no, after having complained now. So they were into it enough to complain, but now, oh no, this is a waste of my time. What do you mean it's a waste of your time? First of all, how do you even know? You're a student. I'm the teacher. If I think it's a waste of your time, I will say so. But if I don't think it's a waste of your time, I will say that. And actually, I don't think it's a waste of time. And one more thing, and I don't mean to, there are other people, I don't want to go on and on. In my experience, there are a goodly number of instances in which the complaint is, in my view, not a complaint that is an authentic complaint. You use the words of authenticity. My sense is that sometimes what we're talking about is authentic, but sometimes I don't think it's authentic. I think it's made up. I think it's either made up or a script that people have been told to use. This is what you're supposed to say, and then they say it. So I think I want to be. I want to interrogate. That's right. I want to interrogate everything. Also, I want to be able to interrogate the complaint. The complaint is not above interrogation.
So one idea,
I mean, we could go on, but I'm going to let you.
So one idea I'd like to throw out here is the traditional framing of free speech, whether we're talking about a legal concept or a cultural concept, as a negative right, versus what I hear from Uli Sigelben-Porath and some others in the literature is more of a framing of free speech as a negative right with positive dimensions. And so that's perhaps another way to think about the relationship with equality. So I'll throw that out and folks can think about that and respond if they like. But I know we have some excellent questions that have been directed towards Keith as well. And I see a few other hands going up. So Keith, we'll go to you to pick up on some of those academic freedom issues.
Yeah, so I personally wanted to pick up on this last exchange a little bit about the countering the argument that people might find exhausting because it questions their equality or humanity or core values and the like. And I think it depends a lot on the context as to how we ought to think about and respond to those kinds of actions, although I'm not all sympathetic with ever actually suppressing the speech in context, but it makes a difference. For example, what we're talking about is a student who comes and says, you've assigned something on your syllabus, or you're dealing with a subject matter that I find to be where I think I'm particularly affected because it's questioning things that are very core to me. And you can imagine a whole wide range of things where that's true. This is particularly salient for me at the moment, for example, because I'm teaching a class in American political thought and how to make decisions about what do I include in this class on American political thought. And I have on there readings that are pro-slavery advocates as part of those readings. I have advocates for Jim Crow as part of those readings, advocates for people who wanted to suppress the Black vote as part of those readings. A lot of that stuff often does not get included in American political thought class, but I think it's actually crucial to include it precisely because I don't want to sanitize the history. I want people to see, what does the defense of Jim Crow actually look like? What did they actually say? It's quite ugly, right? But and you shouldn't hide that history. You want to expose it and grapple with it. And so it'd be one kind of response if a student were to come to me and say, why are you making me read this material that I find so offensive and disturbing, given my own particular background? That's one kind of response you'd have to that kind of concern. It's a very different one if the concern is to say, well, the college Republicans have invited Heather McDonald to come to campus to make a particular speech on a particular policy issue she has concerns with, and I think that attacks me, and as a consequence, I don't want to have that speaker on campus, right? Which is usually how that kind of argument plays out, and that's a very different kind of response and a different set of asks that are being made, not I'm in the audience, somehow Heather McDonald has kidnapped me and forced me to be in the audience, I have to listen to her, which is not how that's going to play out. There are, though, I think transitions, though, to the question that Randy initially posed to me about sort of, are there boundaries about faculty, for example, how faculty are going to hire? And I'm pretty much an absolutist in this regard. So I'm happy to have anyone on campus in this sense. And I know university presidents would probably want to take a different view. They've got a different set of priorities than I do. But I'm actually pretty content with having people, regardless of their particular views, on campus. Not, I think, for the reasons that Professor Tetlock mentioned yesterday, where his concern is, say, well, look, do we need a creationist in the biology department? Do we need a monarchist in the political science department? What kind of political science department are you if you don't have a good feudalist on your faculty? And I don't think there's any particular rationale for that necessarily, right? In fact, part of what we're doing with the scholarly enterprise is making decisions about which topics and subjects and answers and methods of exploration are actually productive and useful and help advance the ball in terms of our scholarly understanding. And some of these people have not risen to the level or haven't made the arguments to demonstrate to us. We need to hear more of that. And so as a consequence, we are systematically excluding them until they can make those arguments, bring the kind of evidence using the right tools to come to us and say, no, actually, I've got some real arguments to be made, in which case we ought to bring them on board, right? Regardless of the conclusions they're reaching, but because they're capable of making good arguments and pushing the ball forward from a scholarly perspective. On the other hand, I couldn't care less what they're doing in their own time outside of that context. And so if they are a perfectly good physicist making genuine knowledge and they adhere to all university policies and all our expectations about what professional behavior looks like, but they also maintain a website in which they are advocating for their anti-Semitic views or their racist views or their whatever alien conspiracy theory views or the like, I'm content with having them on campus. And that may be a red flag that you want to actually be particularly cautious, say, are they in fact behaving professionally? Are they actually doing what they're supposed to be doing in all of their professional activities? But I would be extraordinarily reluctant to want to, either as a faculty member or I think for university leaders, to make decisions about this person is politically out of bounds in their own private viewpoints, and as a consequence, we should exclude them from campus. I don't care how professional they are or how good of a scholar they are. I think that's bad for the larger intellectual climate for campus. It will have a chilling effect broadly across the campus, not to mention whatever unique value we might actually gain from those particular individuals. And frankly, this kind of work is often unique and individualistic. And so if you start systematically excluding particular individuals, you're likely to lose something even on the dimensions you most care about, even if you're excluding them on these other dimensions. And so I'd be just extremely cautious about wanting to go down that path.
Thank you. So let's go to our group for another question. Amna, Professor Khalid.
Oh, please call me Amna. I have many things to say, and I'm trying to decide which ones I want to say. Okay, so the first one about the student and the student coming and making that complaint and listening to the student. I want to go back to that one. And I concur with Professor Kennedy over here, which is, I think okay, let me do this a different way. I think there is a certain inequality that is inherent in the profession of teaching, which is that the professor has experience and has a body of knowledge under control to some degree, and the student does not. And that cannot be undone. The student may bring other experience, and that needs to be understood and engaged with, but the onus of being patient to learn, in my mind, is squarely on the student, in the regard that they have to give time. I'm not saying that professors have nothing to learn, so lest I be misconstrued. I'm just saying, and I know this is a little provocative in our times, that I do expect my students to take my word for something for a little while. Like Professor Kennedy was saying, how do you know it's not worth your while to listen to this? You do not yet have that experience and that knowledge to counter that. So what I'm trying to get to is there is a certain entitlement that I hear today among students, and I'm not blaming the students for it, but that's how I'm hearing it. This sense of, I don't feel like I belong on campus, right? That's fine. You don't feel like you belong. I think you should make an effort to try and belong. You should push the limits of how belonging is construed on campus, but not by going to the administration. Not by feeling like you were entitled to that because the administration owes you something, right? This is not a transactional process. This is a difficult, you have to reckon with difficult ideas, and you have to, it's a give and take. There is tension there. This idea that we should somehow easily be able to get these concessions is something that bothers me. I think students in the past who've led, you spoke about how it was student movements that led to these big changes. They fought for them. They didn't run to the administration for them. They actually, they made demands, but I think, they made them in a different way, in an intellectual way, mostly, not in an administrative fashion. It's like, let's talk about these things, as opposed to, I don't want to talk about these things because it hurts my feelings. I think it's about whether you're closing conversation or opening conversation. And things that close conversation are fundamentally antithetical to our mission as educational institutions. I'm very happy to be challenged by a student who's opening up a conversation. But those who are telling me that, no, I don't want to talk about this because it's going to traumatize me, I have a problem with. Next, I have another point, which is, it's very totalitarian to say that you shouldn't teach this, or this person shouldn't come to campus because it offends me, because you assume that's how everyone else is going to react to it. In fact, arguably, the many people who are driven by that exposure and become, warriors for a cause because they had that experience. So this notion that I should be accommodated and comfortable is what I think is problematic. And I'm not, again, blaming the students for it. Students are students, they're playing around with ideas as they should be. I am blaming a particular kind of indoctrination, which is happening, again, not mostly through faculty, though some might be in it, right? But I think it's coming from this administrative way of managing a problem, because the solution that the students are putting forward is one which is administrative, and it can be, and the admin loves it, right? You check the box off, you've got training now. Okay, now it's easy. So it's been done, and it also protects them legally. So I think, I'm with you, Ulrich, that I want students to challenge and to push the boundaries, but to push them in a generative and productive fashion, not in a fashion that shuts things down. And this is in the broader context of who's controlling the parameters of discourse on campus. And it's not just faculty
I think I'm not. I just want to say one quick thing about equality. I think we should. Go ahead, Christine. Sorry.
Before we go there are two questions from the audience that I want to read because I think they really broaden this discussion. And so, Uli, I'd be interested in having your thoughts as we get these other pieces there too. So the first from Rachel Ernstoff: is it important to distinguish between students who are genuinely offended versus those who are faking? I think it was John McWhorter who said that students who are claiming that reading the N-word hurts them are just faking. If we should try to distinguish between these students, how can we? If we shouldn't, what's to stop them from using their feelings as a weapon to silence others? Okay, so that's our first question. And here's another one to think about in this whole context too, from Chris Newman. I'd be interested to hear a concrete example of anyone actually questioning someone's selfhood. It seems to me that there is a strand of identity politics that engages in self-creep, taking questions of policy or empirical fact whose proponents do not purport or even expressly disavow any denial of anyone's common humanity and construing them as such attacks. For example, I don't think anyone in the past 30 years has ever asserted that, quote, women don't belong in STEM, end quote. Okay, so.
Two quick answers to this. So are people faking it when they say they're offended? I think what I tried to bring up very briefly in my introductory remarks, so many intellectual fields have actually tried to understand how to register human experience. The field of the law is actually engaged in trying to understand human experience in generalizable terms. The field of history has tried to account for experience as a way of providing a different type of evidence. So if you come in and say, I think you're faking it, you are just assuming, and not you, I'm not, but someone is assuming I have epistemological authority to tell you what your experience is. That's why I wanted to put pressure on this word experience and not say it's offended feelings and I'm triggered all this, but I'm saying every field that has been in the university has been engaged with this question. And I come out of a field where this is actually a vital question of who gets to decide that this experience is legitimate. If you take the field that I brought up in the talk that Randy gave on Thursday, of the change in which the culture thinks of harassment, which Randy said is not settled, but there is a shift that people used to say, I'm being harassed, and you say, you're faking it. You can't take a joke. You don't know. I mean, look at, I live in New York State, Andrew Cuomo. Are these women faking it? This becomes a question for the law, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm interested, when does something shift? When people stop saying you're faking it? I think the people who Professor Kennedy talked about, the 4 episodes in American Free Speech, people have been told they're faking their suffering for hundreds of years. So in some ways, I'm interested in opening this up and not settling it. Amna, I would say to you, and this goes to the Chris Newman question also, are there real instances of people being denied their personhood? I think we have a vibrant and somewhat perplexing debate among many faculty whether pronouns are something that students should dictate to us versus us saying, you are right there in that square box on Zoom, I'm going to call you he or she. I refuse to call you they, or I refuse to call you he. I have a lot of friends who said, I can't get used to these pronouns, I don't understand this. And I'm like, you are a teacher in a university, for heaven's sake, how difficult is it to learn something? But the systematic refusal to accept someone's pronoun, regardless of whether the government officials have recognized that pronoun, whether someone's preference is that, the systematic refusal, there we come into the interesting space. Does that not constitute something which I would consider a detriment to learning? I'm not in the legal space yet. I'm not saying it's harassment yet. I'm saying this is not productive. So Amna, I think you're right, but in some ways I'm saying the example, do people really deny people's personhood? And the controversies that have generated so much publicity, there have been speakers who come to campus and out a student as a trans student. And I think we have to think in context that can put that student in jeopardy. In that student, it is not someone else's business to out somebody as a trans person. It is really not someone else's business, I think, and it actually has real life consequences. Every court would recognize that. They wouldn't say, oh, well, what does it matter? They say, well, it matters. It matters how that person lives their life. So I think there are instances where we are, and I really want to stay in the space where it's detrimental to learning. It's not really good. It doesn't work. Versus this is immediately harassment, we must outlaw this immediately. So the classroom, I think, has to be a more open space. And I'm just always curious to think, what if you give the student the benefit of the doubt? Say, wow, you're so upset, you can't study right now. What if you just said, well, maybe you're faking it, maybe not for me to decide. I'm going to try to alter the circumstances that put you in this position. What are we losing? And this is the debate we're having. This is where Keith and I maybe disagree a bit. I say, what if we don't lose so much? What if actually the speaker doesn't come to campus, short of big vice provost Ulrich Baer overruling the whole entire campus and saying, no, like, what do we lose if this person didn't come to campus? And what do we gain? And that's why my question was earlier, who gains and who? And I don't believe, Keith, really, that people with power always pay.
So on that, I think we lose a lot. And so I don't care actually whether people have fake outrage or fake offense or real offense. I think there's no doubt that we have in our current environment lots of people who fake outrage in order to try to achieve some political outcome that they want, because it's an effective tool. And so no doubt there are people who cynically use that tool because it's available, even though they don't feel it. Others are quite genuine in feeling it, and it doesn't really matter in some ways whether I think they're right to feel it or not right to feel it. So I actually in general just don't care about making those particular distinctions. I don't think there's anything useful to be gained by focusing on those distinctions. I think the question is always, what difference should it make for the nature of the enterprise we're engaged in by the fact that some people claim that they are offended or hurt or otherwise harmed by the speech that we're engaged in. In general, I don't think it should make any difference at all in terms of the kinds of activities we engage in, which is to say, that if a speaker comes to campus and gives a speech, and some people claim that they're particularly distressed by that speech, or they're particularly distressed by the fact that some faculty member is discussing subject matter that they find particularly disturbing, I think that the underlying thing that the university ought to be emphasizing is that discussing difficult and controversial things is precisely what we do here. And that sometimes that conversation will be distressing, and that's the nature of the enterprise. At the same time, I think, completely share the view that we ought to be trying to do what we can, especially in the context of the classroom, not to lose the students. The goal is to educate them. And so you want to be able to engage them seriously and not push them away. And that does mean you have to listen to these concerns and try to figure out, how do you manage them? How do you navigate them? How can you work with students so you get them to a point in which they can seriously engage in the conversation you think they need to be engaging in order to learn the kind of material that you want them to learn. And that means you have to take seriously what they're expressing their concerns are and try to engage with them. But I do think that if the reaction to those kinds of concerns is to say, well, let's just not have those kinds of speakers, let's drop those readings, let's drop those subject matters, which is the reaction many administrators have and many students want them to have, I think we will actually wind up losing quite a lot. That the boundaries of serious debate and expression of ideas and actual education in classrooms will shrink dramatically on college campuses in reaction to the extent to which student activists and activists outside of campus can leverage this tool of saying, because somebody can claim offense, we can't have that kind of thing around here. I think it's hard to underestimate, overestimate just how significant that kind of rhetorical play can be, and how much, if it catches on, that this become a weapon for shrinking down what can actually have on college campuses. So one of the starting points of what first got me interested in these ideas in the first place was just after 9/11, University of North Carolina used as its assigned reading for incoming freshmen a book about Islam. And a lot of conservative Christian students and their parents reacted very negatively to that and said, why after 9/11 are you making us read this book on Islam as part of our readings? This is not what we signed up for when we went to a university. And quite appropriately, North Carolina explained to them, this is what you signed up for. You signed up for an education in which you're going to have to engage with things you're uncomfortable with, things that are going to challenge your own deep beliefs as part of the educational process to learn new things. If instead you cave into that and say, oh, you're right, you didn't really sign up for this, this is very distressing to you, what's to be lost if we throw out the book on Islam and don't make conservative Christian students read it? The answer is, I think, by bits and pieces, you're going to lose the entire university.
So I'd like to push on that a bit more. And I think a lot of times these conversations really focus on whether ideas should be censored, whether speech should be censored or not. And yet it seems that's not the only option, right? So And I think both of you have written about this and thought about this. So I'm curious from your perspective, what else can happen to both allow this uncomfortable, offensive, harmful speech to happen, and yet not continue to put the burden totally on the students who feel harmed or targeted? Keith, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think it is essential that we emphasize to students, especially students who want to, and some certainly have an inclination to express this view of, I think people are making me doubt whether I belong here as a university. And I think it's critical that universities do all they can to actually emphasize to all the students that they have admitted and all the other people that we bring to a college campus, we are bringing you here for a reason. We want you here. We, in fact, intend for this to be an open place in which people from a wide range of perspectives and views and places and backgrounds can come to this common community to engage seriously with serious and important ideas and be part of this common enterprise that we're engaged in. That can often be difficult. It can be hard to get that message, but I think it is important to convey that message and to reinforce that message. And universities are not always as good at doing that as they should be. Likewise, I think we as individual faculty trying to engage with these things have to try to set the stage for the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having in a particular context. And we might not always be successful at it. So as I said, I'm teaching this class now in American political thought. I'm having the students read pro-slavery writings. I have students read writings saying women should not have the right to vote. As well as various other legal rights, for example, as well as other kinds of things that are highly controversial and undoubtedly go to core features of the students' own beliefs and principles in general, right? You want to introduce that material in a way that students can actually grapple with it and take it seriously. You want to hear out what their arguments and concerns are with that material. And so, and I hope that you've set up the entire class in a way that by the time we get to that material, they recognize how we're going to deal with it and how we're going to treat it appropriately. Likewise, for example, I had a lecture the other day in which I used a bunch of Thomas Nast political cartoons as part of that. That includes rampant racist and ethnic stereotypes as part of Nast caricatures. And I gave them a trigger warning as to look, we're about to see some political cartoons from the late 19th century, and they are filled with ethnic and racist stereotypes. That is part of what they did and part of the rhetoric of the time. You're about to see it, but Nast was also one of the great cartoonists of the late 19th century that establishes modern political cartooning in its current form. I'm very skeptical of campus administrators giving trigger warnings. I wouldn't want some dean making the decision as to whether or not I wanted to give a trigger warning for my class in general or that particular class. I think faculty for sure should be thinking about that kind of stuff as they're introducing their students that material, and that might cause that reaction. And I think we're not doing a good job if we don't. So we need to bring students to a place where they can seriously engage in the material, and we should be very cautious and careful about how we do it. And sometimes we aren't as cautious and careful about it as we ought to be. But the ultimate goal is how do we get students to the point where they can engage the material, and then try to get them to it and get it in front of them, and then try to help them grapple with it and work their way through it. And whether that's happening in the classroom, whether it's happening in the larger university environment broadly.
So I'll be very brief because I want to hear the other comments, but just to Keith's example, this doesn't happen in universities very much. So I would say, oh, you're teaching history of political thought in America. That's great. Are you considering things that are not published texts, evidence that's not print culture, in addition to this abolitionist literature? And I think there is the interesting space where you say, so in the interest of true free speech and diversity, let's say I'm going to add 2 more texts by Black authors and have Frederick Douglass also here, because that's a simplistic understanding, but to say, I'm actually going to present to you that political debate in the 19th century, as Martha Jones shows in Vanguard, was waged by Black women who didn't even political rights. And that is a new way of even thinking how the canon is constructed. That is what universities are so good at. And then I would say, then you can say, I'm going to teach you this offensive material, but I've actually done the work to think, I'm not just going to stay with the script of what is recognized in my field. That's where universities are so exciting, because then you can say, I'm going to give you something that you don't even think is political speech. It doesn't even register as political theory. And then you're out of this question of oh, there are no women writers or something like that, like we can't diversify the canon. This is when it gets interesting. So I think the responsible thing, what you're saying, Keith, is for teachers to listen to this. And so all I'm saying is when students say decolonize the university, right, diversify the curriculum, instead of sort of putting up a wall and saying, oh, what is that going to mean? It's going to destroy my discipline, to say, how can I creatively participate in this demand, rather than dismissing this demand and saying, you guys are insane, you're trying to dismantle us, you're trying to ruin the university. Say, we're actually trying to do something good. So here I think is an opening for what could speech mean, which I'm sure in your field and in my field, literally 25 years ago, there are things we didn't even know existed, which is an embarrassment in a certain way. And that's a great thing. And that is, I think, partly where students can motivate us. So if students say to me, why are there no texts by trans authors from the 19th century? I mean, I just edited a book of 19th century American fiction. It is an incredibly vibrant debate. What does it even mean to identify somebody as Mexican American in the 19th century or as Asian American? We don't even know the categories. So students can generate and put pressure on our assumptions and parameters, rather than the other way around and saying, you are demanding to have Asian representation in this class. I can't accommodate you because this class is about 19th century poetry. And then I looked around and said, why was I never taught that they are 19th century Asian American poets? Wait, something failed me greatly in the fine schools I attended, and I loved my universities. I'm a very proud graduate of them. But here the opening is, rather than the kind of, the student is demanding something, and if a student walks in and says, Professor Whittington, I can't believe you're teaching abolitionism and you don't really teach the other side. You're like, no, I do. I have 4 texts and 4 texts. Something can happen here. And what if your entire course is only abolitionist literature? And you're saying, yeah, the other stuff, pro-slavery, you can figure it out on your own. It would be a provocation, but I think I just want to keep that space really open. We can talk a little bit more later about administrators having too much power. I was an administrator for 11 years. It's an overestimation how much power they have. To deal with faculty and students, you have no power. I mean, this idea that we sit around here and decree what happens, that is a welcome fantasy, but it's not like that.
So I'd like to go to, let's hear from Joshua and then Amna, and then we'll come back to Uli and Keith for their responses.
So I'd like to press Uli a little bit more on the question from the audience about whether or not people or some are exaggerating the claims that their personhood has been denied, or even sometimes I hear, I don't know if you said this or not, but I know others have said it, that someone has denied their humanity. So I do see this thrown around, and then I go and read the facts of what occurred, and I don't actually see people denying someone's humanity. Often I see a sincere moral or even scientific disagreement. And so just I'm wondering kind of empirically, how often does this actually happen? And then a second question following up on Professor Kennedy's example of, Christopher Hitchens being an atheist, maybe offending some religious folks. Would this be denying someone's personhood? Say in a science class, the professor gets up and says, I'm a naturalist, therefore God doesn't intervene in the world. There is no God, but yet there's a student in the class who believes that they have had a transformational experience where God has intervened in that person's life. And the professor just dismisses this as just all fairy tales and nonsense. Would that also be denying that student's personhood or humanity?
Christine, you want to take Amna's or Dustin's questions also, and then we can go back to all of them. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah. Amna, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this, but the question of, and I agree with Keith that I don't think there's much merit in thinking whether the hurt is fake or not, right? Because the outcome is the important thing. But I will note that in my experience, it's mostly allies who are coming and asking for concessions and presuming how students are going to be responding and saying, you should have given a trigger warning for this, because what if there was X, Y, and Z in class? And that is problematic. So that's just by the by. But the other thing I want to talk about is, I think there is a way in which we are doing, and it's come through to me several times during the conference, is that we are underselling what we do, right? There's like, somehow we classify what we do or what we train as, we continue to see them as soft skills, and we continue to see them as we ourselves are not really standing up for what we do. What we do is hard. What we do is not any less hard than what a physics person does. And I want to push back on that. You know, deep historical analysis that is phenomenal is equally as hard, I will contend. Who is to make that decision about whether that's hard or not? So I think there is something about how we're setting this up, and somehow it's not, to me, advancing the conversation on an equal footing. We need to reconsider the assumptions that we're making ourselves. And I think I'll stop there.
All right. And actually, Dustin, could we come to you for your thoughts as well?
Yes. Yeah, my question actually follows on nicely what Josh said. I had a question primarily for Uri, I guess, about what he said or what he meant when he said pluralism is the premise or the starting point of work in the humanities or of the humanities today. And that makes a lot of sense to me on the one hand. On the other hand, I would then go on to note that pluralism is an ism. And I wonder whether it isn't even a monism itself. I'm a political theorist, and just to give you some example of what I mean from my own field, the two of the foremost political theorists of our time, or of the generation ago, from the two great traditions, analytic and postmodern philosophy, Richard Rorty and John Rawls. And two remarks, one from each of them, came to mind when you made this remark. One, Rawls says at one point that we need to treat comprehensive doctrines which are opposed to our own. We need to contain them like war and disease. And we have to hope, he says, that they cease to exist and people who adhere to them die out or survive only barely. And Richard Rorty, another pluralist, of course, and defender of pluralism, makes another remark that came to mind, and I pulled it up here just briefly. He says, you probably know this passage, it's well known. He says, the fundamentalist parents of our fundamentalist students think that the entire American liberal establishment is engaged in a conspiracy. The parents have a point. When we American college teachers encounter religious fundamentalists, we do not consider the possibility of reformulating our own practices of justification so as to give more weight to the authority of the Christian scriptures. So we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, parents of these children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly to your children rather than discussable. My question is this. I can imagine a university or a college prohibiting certain lines of inquiry on religious grounds. A religious school would do that. And I'm wondering, how does the university, as you see it, differ from a religious school, except that it is animated by a secular rather than a religious absolutism?
Thank you. Those are really great questions. So let's just all meet now for a few years and in seminary to actually think about this. But those are really great questions. I'll be really brief because I want to hear other people also. On the humanity personhood question, we do have examples of Richard Spencer hijacking the university and using the university's relative failure several years ago to really define its true mission and how free speech is in the service of that mission and not its absolute value, and actually abusing the university in a way. And the university got kind of trapped into this, and the poor people of the University of Florida who had to respond to this, they were trapped into a situation. And I think journalism didn't do a great job to actually represent what was at stake, because journalism, for all good reasons, has a vested interest in the First Amendment because it needs the First Amendment for the freedom of the press. And it gets into a sort of a defensive mode around that because it feels under attack itself. I think journalists actually have a kind of difficulty because they're defending two different things here. And, you know, I've had this kind of experience and journalists asking me, you know, how dare you sort of restrict anything? And I said to them, well, can I send you my next op-ed? Can you print it tomorrow? And they said, no, we actually vet our content. I said, oh, really? And at universities, we do that too. we're actually constantly in the process of excluding lots of things. So Richard Spencer actually does advocate all sorts of crazy things, enslavement of people, etc., really crazy things. In some ways, I think that is probably be, and here is the statement I made that made so many people so frustrated. Such ideas are beyond the pale or do not merit further debate. And I wrote that and people lost their mind and was like, what do you mean everything merits debate? And Keith, you have a sentence in there, sort of, you're quoting somebody, but you're saying university administrators should allow the peaceful advocacy of all sorts of things, including genocide, segregation, etc., things like that, master race theories. And I think, yeah, no, it's not worth the time for the university because time is limited and we do lots of things. And so Richard Spencer found the loophole, as you all know, and tricked the university in a way at abandoning its entire mission for the sake of getting a platform. And so he's gone, but that is kind of, I think, where I'm interested in. So why did universities not at that moment say, and why did not one university president, and people did, say, we're going to risk the lawsuit. We're actually going to risk it. And we know the ACLU will be on his side. And I've interviewed David Cole from the ACLU, and they said, yes, we're going to defend him. Yes, we're going to defend him. And I said, really? So how do you defend that to the people who are paying you ACLU dues? But this is where it becomes interesting and where the conversation shouldn't stop. There are people who deny the humanity of other people. I think that's not worth it. That goes directly to Dustin's question. Is the university basically a big project of indoctrinating people into some kind of liberal ideology? That's part of your question, right? Sort of
I thought that's what you were saying.
Yeah, and I'm just reposing your question. I'm saying, is the university this large machine? And I would say yes, actually, to a point. I think when Keith articulated the values of the university, it is the advancement of knowledge and truth. That is a program, you can call it an ideology, that is not actually, that there's certain things that will be excluded from that, falsehood, etc. So I think, yes, Dustin, and I think there, of course, no university president, besides publishing a mission statement, ever wants to say, we're in the business of actually giving you a worldview. But all of us around this Zoom have said, we're actually in favor of having students engage with as many ideas as possible, correct? Not every ideology, as you said, has this interest. If you go to yeshiva or if you go to something, you're not exposed to all sorts of views. You're actually learning a certain worldview that is doctrinaire or dogmatic in the sense of being anchored in an absolute truth of divinity or something like that. So I think universities are actually engaging. So when we all say here, we are open, everybody should have every idea. Would you, Dustin, say that in itself is an ideology, or would we say, no, we are above all ideologies, we're open-ended? And Rawls just said, no, we're not. Let's just not fool ourselves. I mean, every Supreme Court justice at some point will say something like that. We're not just here to let everything happen. We actually want to create something. So I'm just curious what you think. I actually, and believe me, as a university, I'm no longer a university administrator, but university administrators don't want to be caught saying this, but they say it all the time. We all said it in this room. We believe in a plurality, not pluralism, plurality of viewpoints. That's a belief that we think is inherently good, right?
Can I just follow up briefly on that? Just because, so I agree that we should or we try to seek truth in the university. But I'm wondering, do we not seek the truth about whether there's a God or whether we should follow reason or revelation? And if we don't seek that truth, and you seem to say we don't seek it or shouldn't seek it, then we're simply dogmatically accepting an answer to this most fundamental question, in which case we are no longer seeking the truth.
I think I'd love other people to weigh in on this, and I do think the university has a bit of a problem that it cannot quite grapple with religion very well. I think I teach at New York University, which is considered a very liberal school. We have very, very fundamentalist, conservative religious students, and they're just there. The fact that something in their belief system doesn't quite jive with this absolute open-endedness and plurality, we just don't acknowledge, really. That I think religion in public life is a really major dimension. I think, as we all know, it shapes so much. But universities tend to non-religious universities tend to parade themselves as liberal, meaning even religious viewpoints are included. I mean, I was at a new school, there was a panel with Stephen Breyer and the head of the British Supreme Court at that time, the Constitutional Court, and someone said, is religion a value greater than other values in American life? And he said, yes, absolutely. And then someone said, is Christianity a greater value in American life? He said, oh, no, all religions. People said, what? Said, yeah, Buddhism, being Islam, anything in American life is greater. And then there were two other people from different constitutional courts. They said, religion should not trump any other right at all. So the role of religion you bring, so I'm just going to end, but I think other people probably have opinions on that, whether we're engaged in an open-ended business, kind of Einstein's total open economy, or whether we're in a restricted economy, that actually we only allow a certain set of ideas and opinions, and then there's an end to that. A lot of people who've spoken the last 2 days have said, no, we allow all ideas.
So could I pick up on that and with the Richard Spencer example in particular as a way of trying to unpack some of that, right? So if a university faculty member were to invite Richard Spencer to come talk to his class, for example, I'd want a really hard look as to what exactly they're doing under those circumstances. And I can imagine some circumstances where it actually might make sense, depending on the particulars of what's happening in the classroom, what exactly the subject is being taught, who exactly the faculty member is, et cetera, right? So I wouldn't rule it out necessarily, but one would want to think carefully about, okay, what exactly you're doing and why are you doing it under those circumstances. If a university president invited Richard Spencer to come give a distinguished lecture on campus or to give the commencement address, I think that university president ought to be fired the next day for having exercised such horrible judgment of inviting him and try to give Richard Spencer that kind of platform in particular. If a student group wanted to invite Richard Spencer to come speak to them in their particular context, I would say that faculty ought to advise them this is probably a bad idea. What is it you're trying to gain here? Is this actually the most productive use of funds that is available to you, et cetera? But I wouldn't exclude a student group from doing it, and there may be good reasons why a student group, in fact, would want to do that under those circumstances. If a university, as the University of Florida and lots of other state universities did when Richard Spencer was making his little publicity tour around college campuses, makes available on its campus an auditorium that's for rent to any individual from the general public who wants to come rent that. They have a constitutional obligation as a state university to adhere to that. And I think it's quite appropriate that they do. Now that may lead to choices about, do you actually want to have your auditoriums available in this fashion? If Princeton University had such an auditorium that was just available for general public rent, it may force us to make some decisions about, do we actually want to continue doing that? But in part, actually, there's real value in doing it, because not only do the Richard Spencers of the world rent those auditoriums or reserve those auditoriums, book those auditoriums, but so do lots of other groups that are trying to take advantage of the fact that the university provides a venue in which people can come have conversations about all kinds of controversial things, including things that are quite unpopular and that they would otherwise have difficulty finding adequate space for them. So not only would I think it'd be legally problematic, but it'd be contrary to what universities are trying to accomplish if they were to then tell Richard Spencer in particular, sorry, we know you're trying to reserve a public auditorium that's available to anyone from the general public to reserve, but you in particular, we're going to single out and say you don't belong here under those circumstances. For students who might object to that, though, then I think it becomes crucial for universities also to be able to explain to people, both in the outside world and to their own population on the campus, that it's a complicated speech space in universities. There are sometimes speakers on university campuses that in fact are precisely being promoted and held up by the university to accomplish certain kinds of purposes, the faculty, for example. And there are others that simply occupy space within the university campus, sometimes because we to simply tolerate them because they're people of the general public who are allowed on the sidewalks, or they're allowed to rent public auditoriums. And that's a very different kind of space, a very different kind of speaker with a very different kind of platform, even though it's a platform that exists within the campus environment more generally. And we should be able to explain to people the differences between those two things. That there's a difference between a professor who says something, a university president who says something, a speaker who is sponsored by the university president, invited in by the president to come say something, and somebody who sets up a milk crate on the sidewalk on the campus quad, who says something. And I think we've done a terrible job in general of actually explaining that.
I'm kind of curious. So the president should be fired who invites Richard Spencer.
Yeah.
And the president who lets Richard Spencer rent a hall, and then the poor president of the University of Florida, he didn't so the thing he said, like maybe the students who really would be targeted by speech shouldn't come to that area of campus today. And I thought, oh, no, nah. I mean, he's trying his best, but like that means, so let's say Black students shouldn't go to that part of campus today. I mean, we had segregation in this country. So in some ways you're telling them, don't come to that part of the campus today. He didn't say what Randy said, engage with him, debate him. He said, like, just stay out of that area. And then the other thing I'm asking, and I think this is actually quite important about our conversation. So I wrote my piece several weeks before Charlottesville, and then Charlottesville happened. And so Richard Spencer, that's why I said some president should actually let the ACLU drag them into court and say, this is incitement, and this interferes substantially with the operation of the university. And the test, we know the legal tests are so concrete. You have to be imminent, direct, right here. And say, we have now a history of this is just to disrupt the university. This is not educational. And some judge may say, you know what? We give the university a bit of space to actually decide how to run its business. The Michigan cases, they say, we actually give you that space. And someone may then suddenly say, and this is where I was really moved, because I thought Charlottesville was important for many reasons. But one reason was that from Skokie in 76 until Charlottesville, every US president, every single one, from Carter to Obama, had condemned the neo-Nazis. Every single one. David Duke, remember George Bush Sr., David Duke, every single president, and then Trump prevaricated. And that is actually fundamental, because now the university president is in a really tricky position when the students are saying, oh my God, the US president actually doesn't think the Nazis are so bad, and he's on our campus today, and you're saying he's not so bad. So what values do we have? So this shifted, and I think this is where our conference, this shifted something in the public mind. And I think this is when it became interesting to say, where do presidents of universities now find themselves when, and they used to literally have the American president for 2.5 decades say, this is not America, these are not our values. And you had Trump not quite doing it in the same way. So we can debate about what he said or didn't say, but he didn't say it like that. And I think then university presidents are exposed to their faculty, staff, and student criticism and trustees, et cetera, to say, you're actually condoning. You're not granting them a space. You're actually not just tolerating, you're condoning this because you had them on our campus.
I think it's quite reasonable for university presidents, in the case of Richard Spencer, for example, coming and renting the public auditorium, for example, for a university president to tell people, look, this is not a university-sponsored event. He is just like any other member of the public who has a right to rent the auditorium, and he has done so. We do not encourage members of our community to go listen to him, because in fact, we don't think he has anything useful to be said. And so in no way, shape, or form do we sponsor him. Moreover, we think that the speech he gives is in fact incompatible with many of the values that the university itself is quite deeply committed to. I think under those circumstances, it's quite fine. Although I'm actually think that university presidents should not say very much if a faculty member were to say various controversial things. University presidents should mostly not condemn faculty members in that context. But I think this Richard Spencer renting auditorium, I think perfectly reasonable for president to try to explain and draw the line about what exactly this person is doing in this part of campus and what the implications are. Certainly, he should not go so far as to say, therefore, everyone should just stay away from that part of campus, right? That's not the best way of handling it. And I think one thing that Charlottesville in particular highlighted was that the University of Virginia probably not thought through very carefully what its existing rules were about time, place, and manner regulations about public protests and speeches. And one thing that came out of Charlottesville was that they revisited that and drafted a whole bunch of new rules to restrict what kinds of public protests can occur on campus and where. And that still means that people like Richard Spencer can still find places on the University of Virginia campus to hold protest. What that means, though, they cannot do it immediately outside a student dorm, for example, which is what was possible at the time of Charlottesville itself. And so I think universities quite reasonably can make what we characterize as content neutral time, place, and manner regulations that limit what kinds of speeches and protests and activities occur on campus in ways they're the least disruptive possible to other activities on campus. But the key there is, again, sort of the content neutrality of those regulations, that you actually apply them equally to other similarly situated contexts. And universities, I think, have not always been great about actually doing that in a neutral and even-handed fashion. But there's nothing wrong with having such restrictions, and I think it's quite appropriate to have them, and the university ought to enforce them when it's appropriate to enforce them.
So there's another question in our Q&A from Shikha Dalmia that I'd like us to turn to. And Keith, this one's for you. So here we go. But would Keith admit that there is a difference between him including pro-slavery material and an actual notorious slavery advocate pushing that material in a con law class? In the latter case, how does a Black student do what Professor Kennedy suggests, namely stick up for his humanity, given that there is an inherent power differential between a professor and a student? So isn't it appropriate for the tenure process to ensure that certain kinds of thinkers not be allowed to teach, contrary to April Wasserman's suggestion to open the faculty door to everyone? In other words, we are all merely arguing about where a line be drawn, not that a line ought to be drawn. So there's a lot there. Where would you like to?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, and a potentially difficult question depending on the discipline, right? I mean, so as I suggested earlier, right, you don't need the creationist in the biology department in order to think that you have adequate intellectual diversity in your biology department. You're making progress on the scholarly enterprise, and likewise, you don't need a monarchist in your political science department to think that your political science department's doing a good job. But there are other decisions that are actually much closer to the line, and as a consequence, much more in the gray area to think about, well, should we really have this kind of person operating in our philosophy department, our political science department, for example, given how we understand the scope of the discipline now, given this person's adherence to disciplinary norms, et cetera. I think we would certainly want to insist that everyone adhere to disciplinary requirements and norms, both in their classroom context and their other professional engagements. And universities are not, in general, I think, actually very good about insisting on that and actually enforcing it in context. I think it's extraordinarily hard to do it in practice, but nonetheless, there are contexts in which we ought to do it. And so the easy case is the engineering professor who decides to spend the class day ranting about Donald Trump, for example. The much tougher case is, for example, my colleague Robert George, who is a prominent conservative Catholic intellectual with very well-known positions on the morality of homosexuality, for example, who teaches gay marriage cases and other constitutional law cases relating to that subject matter in his classes, as well as teaches scholarly work on those controversies in his political philosophy and morality classes. Now, I have a great deal of confidence in my colleague about how he teaches those classes. I've seen him teach that material, and so I know that he does it in a way that I actually have a great deal of faith, despite and how he does it, and he does it in a professional way that's extremely engaging for students, despite their particular views, despite his particular views. But I can certainly understand the nervousness that you would have faculty who, in fact, are not going to be able to keep very separate their own personal views and the issues they're trying to present in class, and as a consequence, are not going to behave in a very professional way when they're actually presenting that material. And universities should be on guard again about that and try to insist the faculty conduct themselves professionally in those circumstances. But again, I think there's lots of gray areas and hard cases, and extremely hard to enforce. But as a principle matter, I think that's true.
All right, Uli.
Well, let's go to Randy first, and I'll come back in. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. I was simply going to make two comments. One goes back a few minutes. Uli, you made a comment about, how things change, and don't we need to be careful about, in a sense, putting down people's feelings. And I think we do need to be careful. And a case that immediately came to my mind when you made your comment was the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court of the United States upholds separate but equal, and says to the people who are complaining, basically, get over it. You're being too thin-skinned. Why do you feel put down? And in your comments, you did say, and I think rightly so, over the years, people say, can't you take a joke? The put down of women, notorious, over the years, you're being a shrew, can't you take a joke? Chill out. So I think that's a good point. And I think that one needs to be careful about, impatience with complaint. So point taken, and I'm talking out loud to myself, because I think that I think that I've probably been guilty of that to some extent. So I think that's a nice point. I still say, however, that one has to be careful on the other side. This gets to my second point. In this conversation, we've talked a bit about tough cases, and Keith was just talking about difficult cases. In a whole bunch of the controversies that have come up around these subjects, the cases weren't, as far as I'm concerned, as complicated as the ones that Keith has so ably wrestled with us. So let me give you one. Law school. A couple of years ago, a teacher in constitutional law gives a final exam in which he asks the question of Brown versus Board of Education. And he asks the students, he gives the students a role. He says, you are the representatives of a segregationist state. Give the arguments for segregation. A bunch of students go, get really angry. They storm off to the dean. They say that this was totally unfair. How could some teacher, put them in this position, blah, blah, blah. No, from what I understand through the grapevine, I don't think that this teacher was disciplined, but, there was an investigation. But let me put it like this. At this law school, nobody's going to ask that question anytime soon. Now, when this was brought to my attention, I must say, I said, oh my gosh, are you kidding? Thurgood Marshall would have had no problem with anybody asking that question. If he was teaching, he would ask that question and would have no problem with asking it, and would demand that students answer it, and would say that if a student is unable to answer that question well, that shows a law student who has not been well prepared. So, I mean, I say that because earlier I talked about, switching roles. Why not? And one last thing, in our discussion, I mean, we've been talking about higher education, and I think, there's various levels of higher education. I think our conversation would be much more difficult if we were talking about elementary school, high school, junior high, high school. We have not. We have been talking about college students, and we've been talking about students, graduate students, students in professional school. I think for that range, when somebody is in college, it seems to me that we actually should be more demanding. We should demand that people engage as adults, and we should, and this goes back again to your point, Uli, equip people to do that. We should not expect that they are immediately able to do it. After all, they're just students. But we should equip them to do it. But equipping them to do it does put pressure on them. But I don't think that we should be afraid of putting pressure on them. The world is a tough place.
No, I appreciate that. I'll just say one sentence. I mean, the aim of my book was to equip students to find another way of articulating their grievances and not to use a language which I find pretty useless to say I'm offended or triggered. That was the aim. And the aim was not to end a conversation, it is to start a conversation, to say, here's different tools. They may not work. People will dispute them. They are against this. They don't agree with this. This is not dominant jurisprudence necessarily, but it has made some inroads. Then you have a tool. That doesn't mean you have the answer. But I want to hear from Musa. I think Amna have their hands up as well. But thank you, Randy.
Exactly. All right. So Musa and then Amna, let's hear from you.
Yeah. So, it's funny because I put my hand down. I was going to ask this question, but then Randy's, the example Randy gave made me want to put my hand back up and ask the question after all. Because so basically, I think, so this case, for instance, where the students were asked to defend segregation. I mean, I think part of the reason why they would be hesitant to do that and why they would really, it isn't necessarily because they would feel kind of horror contemplating the case for, I think they would be worried about getting in front of a classroom of their peers who are judging them and maybe being seen as being a little too effective or a little too passionate, in the social context of getting up in our current climate, or in anything approximating our current climate and making a case for segregation. I think the sort of social concerns, how you might be perceived by your peers, I think is something that plays into a lot of these things. And this is actually part of my frustration with a lot of the conversations about open expression and whatever on campus, is they focus on things like outside speakers. And that's such a peripheral part of campus life. And, like the classroom is a totally different context because there's this relational thing is so important. These are like, 30 to 50 people or more who are trapped in this room together for the next 16 weeks. And so the relationships that they have with their peers and between them and their professor persists, right? So if something weird happens in the lecture hall, you leave the lecture hall and you go on your life. Something weird happens in the classroom on Tuesday, on Thursday, you're right back there with all those same people. And so this sort of social context, I think, in which some of this stuff plays out, and the sort of social pressures that a lot of students feel, because again, like from a lot of the polling, it seems like concern about being judged or ostracized by peers drives a lot of this self-censorship for students and faculty. And so if I'm trying to think about, I'm sure this is not the sort of case they made to the dean was probably something about harm or whatever. But if I'm trying to think about like why they would be hesitant, why a lot of students would be hesitant to get up in front of the class and argue for segregation. Like I think this kind of social dimension part is an important piece. Anyway, so I guess how do we address this kind of soft power bit of the challenges to open expression, because not all of it is again about the law or the rules or the policies. There's also this kind of social milieu in which we're all dropped that places major constraints on what people are willing to express or not, and whatever. Yeah,
thanks. That's helpful. So again, power comes not just from above, but from below, right? And from multiple directions. Amna, let's go to you for a comment, and then Richard to you. And then we'll go back to our two panelists for their final comments to wrap up the event. Amna, go ahead.
Thank you. So Musa, to address what you're saying, I hear you, and I appreciate that there are these real costs. And I think we can really push against the social cost piece by maybe looking at theater departments, right? There you're supposed to take on a role if you're acting and be convincing, no matter how much of an asshole the character is. And I don't see why we can't expect that, or at least frame it like that. I think if it's framed like that, our students might be more willing to take it. Okay, come on, this is also a test of your acting skills, right? For a law class, it is absolutely imperative that students learn this, because they will be seeing people who are dealing with, who are advocating for Harvey Weinstein, for instance, and they have to learn how to do that and how to contend with that. So we need to find, I feel like Professor Kennedy is a bit of my hero right now, in that I think we need to make demands of students because we're in the business of training them, and I appreciate the social costs, but we change the culture by setting higher expectations of our students and pushing them higher, instead of by, and I know you're not saying this, Musa, but instead of lowering our expectations, because this is something we demand of them for their training and their ability to survive in the world in a way that they can be effective and true to themselves. And my second point is about, Ulrich, you said, what happens if, harassment used to be, get a thicker skin, women, and today we recognize it, and we're glad we recognize it. I'm very sure that there are many men who are not glad that we recognize it, right? So there's always a tension. So let's say 20 years from now, okay, we recognize that this is harm, and that's made it. Professor Kennedy said that, the public opinion, the court of public opinion decides it, and it then becomes law. And maybe it will become law that students should be given trigger warnings or whatever, all the things that I'm objecting to. In that case, I will lose out. And I think right now that I would be, even then say, I'm happy to be a bigot of the older time. But to assume that we have a desire to be on the right side of history, on the right side of future, in anticipating how we're going to react. We can't do that. We have to hold to our convictions. Perhaps 50 years from now, I'm just going to be a crone who has these old, ideas, and, whose own kids who are jumping around me right now are like, we don't want to do much with you. And that's okay. But we're assuming that the march, this is an assumption we're making, that the march of history is in a direction of progress. And that's not true. Shitty decisions get made. We move to shitty positions, and then we have to go back. So I think we need to recognize there is a tension, and that's okay. And some side will win.
So another aspect that we haven't yet been able to get to, but hopefully we'll get our two panelists' thoughts on, is also this question of self-appointed watchdog groups, right? So as things change, some people want to really be on the lookout for progress, and other people are thinking of this in a slightly different direction. So I hope we'll be able to get folks' thoughts on watchdog groups related to free speech on campus as well. Richard, can we come to you for your comments? All right, I'm not sure if Richard is right near his computer. So actually, Uli and Keith, we will go to you for your responses. And
does Arthur have his hand up? Arthur, do you have your hand up? Sorry.
Oh, yes, Arthur, that just happened. Okay, go ahead.
Right, thank you. Joe, so this thought that it's been a very, very interesting and complex discussion. Larger theoretical questions juxtaposed with very concrete issues. But there's been an imbalance as to where the concreteness lies, in that what we've considered are all the concrete ways in which free speech can lead to all kinds of bad things. And nobody can deny that free speech can lead to bad things and bad events. But we need some concreteness on the other side about the regulation or censorship of that free speech. And we haven't had a single statement on the, a plan on the table for what exactly how would we want to regulate free speech if we want to regulate it. The only concrete thing that's been suggested was a kind of third-hand reference was made to that famous Princeton letter, where a board of review was being proposed that would oversee people, professors teaching and their research and their publications and so on. And so I guess I'd begin by asking Uli what his opinion is of that Princeton letter. But if he doesn't agree with that, then what would he put in its place? What kind of censorship do we want?
Well, I would not advocate for censorship, and I don't know enough of the Princeton letter, so Keith should weigh in on that because you're at Princeton, so I'm sure Princeton is a pristine, peaceful, pastoral place with no controversy. So I don't know. But Arthur, to your question, I think what's needed is that universities actually do the somewhat exhausting work to articulate their missions continually and not run into these conflicts where we state all sorts of diversity things in the beginning in student life, and then we have classes which no one knows what's happening in the class, and then the president suddenly is in a controversy, and then the media jumps in and says, oh my God. And Keith, you quoted an article from the New York Post that protesters storm NYU when David McGinnis came. I was at NYU. The university was not stormed. It's a university that spread over like 50 blocks in New York City, but the press somehow loves these stories. But Arthur, to your question, what can be done? I think part of it is to actually articulate to students that speech by necessity needs to be regulated, that regulation should be minimal, and we should be very careful of who to give power to. Keith, actually, you went quite far in saying there's some reasons sometimes maybe to exclude a speaker such as Richard Spencer and find arguments to do it, but continually make these arguments very clear and revisit the assumptions. And for example, that's what Randy picked up on, not end up saying, your grievance is ridiculous, we can overrule it. We know this doesn't interfere with your learning. So I think for the university to do that work, Corey Brettschneider at Brown wrote this book, When the State Speaks. When the university speaks all the time, I think this is very important. I have students who come to class, so I teach a seminar right now in person at NYU, and after the violence against Asian American women, I had, for totally different reasons, 4 women in my class talk about how they have been harassed or threatened in New York City in the last week because of the pandemic and things that deserted. This was not planned and meant to happen, but I think it was important because they said, what is the university doing? They think the university continually puts out messages, and faculty are sometimes caught short to say, suddenly you're representing an entire institution that gives you all these messages in student life, and then there's another value over here, and then the law school says this about free speech. And I think to do that work is really important for universities to keep articulating that and keep examining it. This is why my question is about these watchdog groups, which, I'm sort of ambivalent about them. I mean, I've been on the list of, and I've been the target of some of these watchdog groups. It is not a pleasant experience because right-wing people were more organized on social media 4 years ago than left-wing. So I had tens of thousands of people. The options for my free speech conversation my options were demoted, deported, or dead. The New York Times shut down the comments section because there was too much doxing with my kids' information in it. I'm not a victim of this, but I kind of thought, okay, where's the university actually speaking here? To say we actually support robust debate, rather we're going to allow some Twitter mob to run over the university. So I think, Arthur, your question goes to the heart of, and the watchdog groups are really important, but my problem with some of them is, and with the Chicago principles, they keep on saying free speech is the absolute value. That's what the Chicago principles, they do not have the word truth or knowledge in those principles. They're publishing a 2.5-page statement that freedom of expression is the essence of the university. No, it's a vehicle to get to what we want to do. It is like saying democracies exist to have many, many, many elections in a row. Elections are a means to get to what we want, is democratic governance. But to say free speech is the absolute value of the university is simply not correct. It is a place to get somewhere and a tool for that. So I just think there's more need for these kinds of conversations. And I think people also, the good thing is of the last couple of years, people have become much more interested in mission statements and what the university stands for. I think that's actually really good. And we all shape the institution we're in, all of us as faculty, staff, students, et cetera. And students have a very vital role, as Amna said, maybe because they're consumers or because there's a kind of liberal marketplace idea. But I think the articulation of these values, rather than a kind of rote reference to free speech as an absolute value in First Amendment, which just does not help. It just does not help at all. And I think it has actually hindered the debate in a certain way. I think this conference is really productive because it hasn't defaulted to this thing. The First Amendment is self-explanatory, and we know what it means. It opens up something. But I think, Arthur, I would push back on the one thing. We don't need censorship. We need a better understanding of how the most people can be involved in speech. And I think that hasn't really happened in universities yet. I think the default is still to give people with power and privilege access to speech and to not let other groups come in. And I think there the university could say, if every watchdog group had a program to say, we're also going to give underprivileged voices a grant, I think that would be awesome. I'm sorry to say, if they all give grants to, self-identified conservatives, like that doesn't seem to me diversity. It seems to me sort of just, an agenda. So I'd stop right here because I think Lee has another question, and then Keith has the last word.
So as the moderator, I have the unfortunate task of keeping us on time, and we're actually already 15 minutes over, but I do want to give the last word to Keith, and then we'll have to wrap up this tremendous conversation.
Well, just relative to the Princeton letter, just in my best Kent Brockman voice, I'll just say I, for one, welcome my German department overlords who will determine whether I should be fired for how I teach pro-slavery material in my American political thought class. I've written about this proposal, which I just think is an extraordinary threat to academic freedom if it were replicated, and I would ask my colleagues in the German department, for example, who are many of the advocates for this proposal can be found, whether they really would want me, for example, serving on that committee and deciding who ought to be fired in the university for engaging in racist speech, because they probably wouldn't like the answer very much. And if they contemplate that leads you to the core concern about how free speech and the problems of creating authorities who get to monitor and suppress it operates more generally. We should be just extraordinarily reluctant to invite very many of those, and we ought to do it under only the most extreme conditions when when it serves the larger purpose that we're trying to serve. And actually, the mention of the New York Times comment section is a nice indication of this, right? That you make decisions about what's the right forum, what's the right vehicle for trying to have a good discussion so you can advance a conversation in a helpful way. It turns out anonymous comment sections on major newspapers is not generally a good way of doing that. There was a golden moment of the internet where we thought maybe it would be. Turns out not so much. And so a lot of newspapers have backed away from that, and I think quite reasonably, right? You lose something from having made that decision, but you probably gain more. And that's likewise what we have to think about as we think about lots of other fora and how they operate in the university context, but also more generally, to what degree are these vehicles actually effective at advancing the thing that we most care about? And in the context of universities, I think the thing that we most care about is trying to do our best to advance an environment in which people can debate controversial ideas, take them seriously, and lead to whatever conclusions they think those arguments and evidence might lead them to think they are.
Thank you so much. I hope that everyone attending has enjoyed this panel and learned as much from it as I have. And special thanks not only to our two wonderful panelists, Professor Whittington, Professor Baer, but also, of course, to the conference organizers for giving us the space to have this conversation. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing the conversation during the last panel session.
4:30.